pop in your lower back, an electric shock running down the leg, from the buttock through the back of the thigh to the calf, a line of fire tracing a nerve root you did not know existed until it announced itself at maximum volume. You went from upright to unable to stand straight in one motion, one lift, one twist that felt no different from the thousands that preceded it. And then the MRI. A disc bulging into the spinal canal, a nerve root compressed, the word herniation entering your vocabulary alongside a conversation about surgical options. Rarely did the conversation include a second fact. Approximately 75 to 80% of herniated discs resolve without surgical intervention. The body sends immune cells to the breach site, treats the extruded material as non-self, and digests it over 3 to 12 months. The disc that was presented as a surgical problem may already be a problem the body is solving through a clearance mechanism nobody mentioned during the consultation. The physics of how the disc is engineered, why it breaches, and how the immune system digests the herniation without surgery is where the physics leads. The disc between every two vertebrae is a pressurized hydraulic system enclosed by a laminated composite wall, an engineering structure identical in principle to plywood and carbon fiber layup. The wall breaches when decades of accumulated fatigue and flexion loading exceed its capacity at the weakest structural point, and the immune system treats the extruded core material the way it treats any tissue it encounters for the first time. It sends macrophages to digest it. What makes the disc wall stronger than any single layer of collagen could be? You have seen the engineering. Every sheet of plywood you have held demonstrates the principle. Thin layers of wood bonded together with the grain direction alternating by 90 degrees between each layer. A single sheet of wood splits easily along its grain. Two sheets bonded with opposing grain directions resist splitting in both directions because the fibers of one layer bridge across the weakness of the layer below. The more layers, the more directional coverage, the stronger the composite. Plywood, carbon fiber aircraft panels, and your intervertebral disc all use this principle. Fiber architecture of the human annulus fibrosus consists of 15 to 25 concentric lamellas, each lamella a thin sheet of parallel collagen fibers. Each lamella's fibers run at approximately 30 degrees from the horizontal axis of the disc. Marchand and Ahmed measured this architecture in spine. Crucially, each successive lamella alternates the fiber direction plus 30 degrees minus the lamination angle plus the lamination angle minus the lamination angle. The alternation creates a structure where no single direction of force can split the wall because every directional weakness in one layer is bridged by fibers running in the opposite direction in the adjacent layer. If you pull the disc in one direction, the fibers aligned in that direction resist. Pull in the perpendicular direction and the fibers of the alternate layer resist. Twist the disc and the crossing pattern of alternating layers resists torsional shear in both rotational directions. The laminated construction provides multi-directional strength from a material, collagen, that has enormous tensile strength along its fiber axis, but virtually no strength perpendicular to it. The engineering solution is the same solution the plywood industry discovered independently. Arrange weak perpendicular layers in alternating directions, and the composite becomes strong in every direction. Now, the collagen fibers in each lamella are not arranged randomly at the lamination angle. The angle is the engineering optimum for a pressurized cylinder. A thin-walled pressure vessel, the standard engineering model for pipes, tanks, and biological tubes under internal pressure, experiences hoop stress in the circumferential direction at twice the magnitude of axial stress in the longitudinal direction. The 2-to-1 stress ratio means the wall must resist circumferential stretching twice as strongly as longitudinal stretching. The fiber angle that optimally resists this 2-to-1 stress distribution, derived from the mathematics of fiber-reinforced composites, is approximately 55 degrees from the longitudinal axis, or equivalently, approximately 35 degrees from the horizontal. The disc's 30-degree fiber angle sits within the optimal range for a biological pressure vessel under the specific loading conditions the spine produces. Your disc is engineered to the same specification an engineer would calculate for a pressurized cylinder, and it arrived at that specification through natural selection rather than a drafting table. Inside this laminated wall sits the nucleus pulposus, a gel core composed of approximately 80% water by weight, held in a matrix of proteoglycan molecules that attract and retain water through osmotic pressure. The proteoglycans, primarily aggrecan, are massive molecules consisting of a protein core with dozens of glycosaminoglycan side chains extending outward like bristles on a bottle brush. Each glycosaminoglycan chain carries sulfate and carboxylate groups at regular intervals along its length, and each of these chemical groups carries a fixed negative charge. The negative charge density across the aggregate of all the aggrecan molecules in the nucleus is enormous. Each negative charge attracts a cation from the surrounding fluid, and the resulting ion concentration gradient draws water into the nucleus through osmotic pressure, creating a swelling pressure of approximately 1 to 3 atmospheres even before any external load is applied. The nucleus is pressurized at rest because the chemistry of the proteoglycans demands water, and the water that enters under osmotic pressure inflates the nucleus against the annular wall like air inflating a tire. The inflation pretensions the annular fibers, loading them in their strongest direction, tension along the fiber axis before any external force arrives. When you stand, compressive loads from body weight and muscle tension increase the intradiscal pressure further. Standing produces approximately 600 kilopascals, sitting upright approximately 900, and bending forward to lift a weight approximately 1,000 to 2,000 kilopascals, depending on the load and the angle. Nachum Chon quantified these pressures in spine, across multiple postures and loading conditions. Hydraulic pressure distributes compressive loads radially outward against the laminated annular wall, converting vertical compressive force into circumferential tension in the annular fibers. Pascal's law applied to a biological container, pressure applied to a confined fluid, transmits equally in all directions. The disc bears weight like a pressurized tire. What happens when you bend forward and the pressure shifts? Toothpaste physics enters. When you flex the spine forward, the vertebra above the disc tilts anteriorly. The anterior edge of the vertebra compresses the front of the disc. The nucleus, being a fluid, cannot be compressed. It shifts posteriorly toward the back of the disc like toothpaste being squeezed toward the cap. The posterior annulus receives the redirected pressure at the precise location where the wall is thinnest, the lamellae fewest, and the structural margin smallest. The back of the disc is the weakest point in the laminated wall, and flexion loading directs the hydraulic pressure to that weakness. With every forward bend, every lift with a rounded spine, every sustained seated posture where the lumbar curve flattens and the posterior annulus bears the shifted load. Failure does not arrive in one event. It accumulates across decades through fatigue mechanics identical to the fatigue that fractures metal components in aircraft and bridges. Each flexion cycle produces microscopic strain in the posterior annular fibers. Most cycles fall within the elastic range. The fibers deform and return without damage. Occasionally, the strain exceeds the elastic limit at a localized point, and a microtear forms in a single lamella. The tear is too small to produce symptoms. It is too small to see on any imaging. But the tear changes the stress distribution in the surrounding tissue. The intact lamellae adjacent to the torn one now carry the load. The torn lamella can no longer bear. Stress concentrates at the tip of each microtear, the same stress concentration physics that causes a crack in a windshield to propagate from a single chip. Each subsequent flexion cycle applies the concentrated stress to the adjacent intact lamella, which tears sooner than it would have without the stress concentration from its neighbor. One lamella tears, the next absorbs the redistributed load. That lamella tears sooner, and the cascade progresses from the innermost lamella outward toward the disc surface over months and years of cumulative loading. Herniation that arrived during an unremarkable lift, a grocery bag, a laundry basket, a child picked up for the 1,000th time, was the final lamella in a cascade that began years earlier with a microtear you never felt. The load was ordinary. The structural margin had been narrowing with every tear in the cascade, and the ordinary load was the one that exceeded the margin the remaining intact lamellae could sustain. My understanding of the pop I felt 3 years ago arrived when the flexion loading physics met the materials science. The pop was the sound of lamellae failing. The posterior annulus, fatigued from decades of cumulative loading cycles, finally breached under a load that was not exceptional by any measure, but was the load that exceeded the remaining structural margin. The lift that herniated the disc was unremarkable. The 3 decades of flexion loading that preceded it were the engineering cause. Laminated wall breached, the gel extruded, and then the immune system encountered material it had never seen before. And what happened next is the physics nobody mentioned in the MRI conversation. Why does the body digest its own disc material? Embryonically, the nucleus pulposus develops from the notochord, a structure that is sequestered inside the disc before the vascular system and immune system mature. The nucleus has no blood supply. No blood vessels penetrate the healthy disc. The immune system has never been exposed to the proteins inside the nucleus because the proteins have been sealed inside an avascular, immune-privileged compartment since before birth. When the annulus breaches and nucleus material extrudes into the epidural space, the immune system encounters the nuclear proteins for the first time. The immune response is immediate and vigorous. The extruded material is treated as foreign tissue. Macrophages migrate to the site, adhere to the surface of the extruded nucleus, and begin phagocytosis, the process of engulfing and enzymatically digesting the material. The macrophages release matrix metalloproteinases that break down the proteoglycan matrix. Neovascularization, the growth of new blood vessels into the breach site, is itself a remarkable process. The extruded nucleus triggers angiogenic signals that recruit endothelial cells from existing blood vessels in the epidural space. The endothelial cells proliferate, form tubes, and extend new capillary networks into the herniated material, creating a blood supply where none previously existed. The new vessels deliver macrophages, oxygen, and nutrients to a tissue that had been completely avascular for the individual's entire life. The vascular invasion is what makes the immune clearance possible and what makes the resorption timeline predictable. Without the new blood vessels, the macrophages could not reach the herniated material in sufficient numbers to digest it within the 3 to 12-month timeline. The serial imaging documents. Macrophage-mediated phagocytosis is the primary clearance pathway for extruded disc material. Cunha and colleagues demonstrated this mechanism in the Spine Journal. The process is measurable on serial MRI imaging. A herniation visible on one MRI can be demonstrably smaller on a follow-up MRI 3 to 6 months later, and absent on a 12-month scan. The body is performing a biological microdiscectomy, removing the extruded material through immune digestion rather than surgical excision, reaching the same structural endpoint through biology rather than a scalpel. Larger herniations resorb more completely and more frequently than smaller ones. Zhang and colleagues confirmed this in a meta-analysis published in International Orthopedics. The finding is counterintuitive until the immune physics explains it. A larger extrusion exposes more surface area to the immune system, providing more contact area for macrophage adhesion and phagocytosis. The bigger the herniation, the more surface the immune cells can access, and the more efficiently they digest it. If your MRI shows a large herniation, you may carry a higher probability of spontaneous resolution than a person with a smaller herniation, the opposite of what the size of the image implies. Well, the immune resorption I learned about 6 weeks after my own MRI changed the weighting from passive endurance to active physics. The macrophages were already at the site. The digestion was already measurable. The timeline was 3 to 12 months, and the body had begun the clearance the moment the nucleus contacted the epidural blood supply. The MRI conversation had presented the herniation as a static structural failure, a snapshot of damage frozen in a single image. The biology was performing a dynamic repair the image could not show. The macrophages advancing, the neovascularization extending, the material shrinking month by month along a clearance curve the immune system was already executing. The second MRI would show what the first could not, the trajectory. The disc was not broken, it was mid-repair. The immune system digests the herniation, but the nerve that was compressed during the weeks or months before resorption has its own injury and its own recovery timeline, and the two timelines do not run in parallel. What does the compressed nerve experience and why do symptoms persist after the compression is relieved? When the extruded nucleus contacts the nerve root, two mechanisms produce pain simultaneously. Mechanical compression. The physical mass of the extruded material presses on the nerve root, deforming the axons, impeding axonal transport, and disrupting the myelin sheath that determines conduction velocity. Chemical inflammation. The nucleus pulposus releases inflammatory mediators, tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin-1, and interleukin-6, directly onto the nerve root surface. The inflammatory mediators are preformed inside the nucleus. Kang and colleagues documented this in Spine, confirming that the nucleus contains preformed inflammatory molecules that activate the moment they contact the vascularized tissue outside the disc. Chemical inflammation explains a clinical observation that mechanical compression alone cannot. Small herniations sometimes produce more pain than large ones. A small extrusion that releases a high concentration of inflammatory mediators onto the nerve root produces intense chemical irritation at the nerve surface, a pain signal that has nothing to do with how much the nerve is physically compressed and everything to do with the concentration of inflammatory molecules bathing the nerve surface. Tumor necrosis factor alpha binds to receptors on the nociceptive nerve fibers in the nerve root, activating intracellular signaling cascades that increase the production of pain, mediating ion channels in the nerve membrane. More pain channels means a lower threshold for firing. Stimuli that would normally pass beneath the detection threshold now trigger action potentials that propagate to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord as pain signals. The nerve root becomes hypersensitive, responding to mechanical forces, temperature changes, and chemical concentrations that a healthy nerve root would ignore. Interleukins 1 and 6 recruit additional inflammatory cells to the site, amplifying the immune response and extending the chemical irritation across the weeks the resorption requires. The pain is partly chemical, partly mechanical, and the ratio varies between herniations. A large herniation with minimal chemical release may produce less pain than a small herniation with intense chemical inflammation, a discrepancy that confuses both you and the physician until the dual mechanism is understood. And then, peripheral nerve regeneration proceeds at approximately 1 millimeter per day once the compression is relieved, but the regeneration does not begin immediately. First, the damaged portion of the axon distal to the compression site undergoes Wallerian degeneration. The axon segment beyond the injury degenerates completely, fragmenting into debris that the Schwann cells surrounding the axon must clear before regeneration can proceed. The Schwann cells that previously maintained the myelin sheath around the intact axon switch roles, transforming into phagocytic cells that engulf and digest the axonal and myelin debris. Once the debris is cleared, the Schwann cells form a guidance tube, a hollow channel of aligned cells that the regenerating axon can follow back to its original target. At the proximal end of the injury, the nerve cell body in the dorsal root ganglion ramps up protein synthesis, shifting from a maintenance program to a growth program, and forms a growth cone, a specialized structure at the tip of the regenerating axon that navigates the guidance tube at approximately 1 millimeter per day. The growth cone extends finger-like projections called filopodia that sense the chemical and physical guidance cues the Schwann cells provide, steering the regenerating axon along the path the original axon followed. The rate is set by the speed of axonal transport, the molecular motor system that ships structural proteins, organelles, and signaling molecules from the cell body down the length of the axon to the advancing growth cone. The motor proteins, kinesin and dynein, walk along microtubule tracks inside the axon, carrying their cargo at a rate that biology cannot accelerate beyond the 1 millimeter per day ceiling the molecular motors dictate. 1 millimeter per day translates to approximately 1 inch per month, approximately 30 centimeters in a year. If the nerve root was compressed at the L5 to S1 level, the most common location for lumbar disc herniation, and the symptoms extended to the foot through the sciatic nerve distribution, the total nerve length requiring regeneration is approximately 1 meter. At 1 millimeter per day, full recovery of sensation and motor function in the foot may take 10 to 12 months after the compression is relieved, months after the disc herniation has resolved on imaging. You whose follow-up MRI shows complete resorption of the herniation, but who still experiences numbness in the lateral foot or weakness in ankle dorsiflexion, is experiencing the nerve regeneration timeline catching up with the disc timeline. The disc healed in months. The nerve may take a year. The two timelines are independent, and the persistence of nerve symptoms after disc resolution reflects the nerve still regrowing at the rate axonal biology permits. Now, the disc that needs to heal requires nutrients. The disc has no blood supply. It feeds through a process called imbibition, the same mechanism the posture discussion described as the disc's nutrition pump. When the disc is loaded during standing and walking, the compressive force squeezes fluid out of the nucleus through the cartilaginous end plates, thin plates of hyaline cartilage covering the top and bottom surfaces of each disc. The end plates are the disc's nutrient filter. Capillary buds from the vertebral body terminate at the end plate surface, and the nutrients they carry, oxygen, glucose, amino acids, diffuse through the end plate matrix into the nucleus below. The end plate is the only route nutrients can take because the disc has no blood vessels of its own. With age, the end plates undergo progressive calcification, calcium phosphate crystals depositing in the cartilage matrix, and physically blocking the pores the nutrients must pass through. The calcification is a second age-related mechanism compounding the dehydration. The nucleus loses water content because the proteoglycans degrade, and simultaneously the end plate restricts the nutrient flow the proteoglycans need to be repaired. Two mechanisms degrading the disc from opposite sides of the same structure. When the load is released during lying down or postural change, the osmotic pressure of the proteoglycans draws fresh fluid back in, carrying dissolved oxygen, glucose, and amino acids from the vertebral capillary bed. The loading-unloading cycle is the disc's circulatory system, driven by mechanical compression rather than a heartbeat. The disc is the largest avascular structure in the body, and every nutrient it receives must cross from the vertebral capillary bed through the cartilaginous end plate and into the nucleus by diffusion. The compression-release cycling accelerates this diffusion by physically pumping fluid across the end plate. Compression pushes waste-laden fluid out, release draws nutrient-rich fluid in. The pump operates with every step you take, every postural shift you make, every time you stand from sitting or sit from standing. The daily loading cycle is the disc's daily meal, and the disc that does not get loaded does not get fed. If you herniate a disc and are told to rest, strict bed rest with no movement, you remove the mechanical loading that drives the diffusion pump. The collagen fibers of the annulus need amino acids, oxygen, and glucose to synthesize new matrix material for repair. Those nutrients arrive through imbibition. Without loading, imbibition stops. Without imbibition, nutrient delivery stops. Without nutrients, repair cannot proceed. Rest removes the repair signal. If rest starves the disc, what feeds it? Modern spine rehabilitation has moved from strict bed rest to early controlled movement within pain tolerance. Gentle flexion extension cycling drives the imbibition pump without repressurizing the breech. Walking, the simplest cyclic loading available, produces the compression-release rhythm the disc requires. The back pain discussion described how the guy wire system prevents the spine from buckling under compressive load. The same walking that activates the guy wires feeds the disc that is trying to heal beneath them. Loading is the treatment. Rest was the obstacle. Immune clearance handles the disc. The annulus repairs through imbibition-fed collagen synthesis. The nerve regenerates at 1 millimeter per day. But if you are over 55, you ask the question the timeline raises. Why did the disc breach now, after decades of handling the same loads? Nucleus water content declines from approximately 80% at 20 to approximately 65 to 70% after 50. Less water means less hydraulic pressure, less effective load distribution, and more direct stress on the annular fibers that must bear the loads the hydraulic system can no longer distribute evenly. The annular fibers accumulate fatigue from decades of loading cycles, millions of flexion-extension repetitions across 30 years of adult activity. The collagen undergoes the same advanced glycation end product cross-linking that stiffens every connective tissue in the body with age. The myode chemistry that reduces the fiber's ability to deform under load and spring back elastically. A stiffer, drier disc with fatigued fibers under the loads it carried without difficulty at 25. The cross-linked collagen cannot absorb the energy of each flexion cycle the way it could when the fibers were flexible. Instead of deforming elastically under load and springing back, the stiffened fibers resist deformation until they fracture brittly, like an old rubber band that snaps rather than stretches. The transition from elastic failure to brittle failure changes the disc's response to the same daily loads from gradual wear to sudden rupture, and the transition progresses with every year of cross-link accumulation. The disc at 50 absorbs the same flexion load as the disc at 25, but the energy that the younger disc distributed through elastic deformation, the older disc concentrates at the weakest point in the laminated wall, and the concentration is what converts an ordinary load into the final load. The engineering margin narrows every decade, and the herniation at 50 is the cumulative fatigue breaching the margin the disc maintained for 3 decades. Approximately 75 to 80% resolve through immune clearance, imbibition-fed repair, and nerve regeneration. The remaining 20 to 25% require surgical intervention, and the physics that determines which category a specific herniation falls into is specific, identifiable, and non-negotiable in 3 circumstances. Cauda equina syndrome. A large central herniation compressing the bundle of nerve roots below the spinal cord terminus. Loss of bladder or bowel control. Numbness in the saddle region. Bilateral leg weakness. This is a surgical emergency requiring decompression within hours to prevent permanent nerve damage. If you experience any combination of these symptoms, the emergency room is the immediate destination. Well, progressive motor weakness despite conservative management. If the nerve is being damaged beyond its regenerative capacity while conservative management continues, surgical decompression removes the compression before the nerve damage becomes irreversible. Foot drop. The inability to lift the front of the foot during walking, progressing despite adequate time and rehabilitation, is the clinical marker. Failure to improve after 6 to 12 weeks of adequate conservative management. Pain persisting despite imaging showing resorption progress, indicating that the inflammatory cascade or epidural scarring has established a pain-generating mechanism independent of the original mechanical compression. The scarring itself can tether the nerve root to surrounding tissue, preventing the normal gliding motion the root requires during leg movement, producing pain with every step that stretches the tethered nerve. In these cases, the herniation resolved, but the secondary damage it caused to the surrounding tissue maintains the symptoms through a different mechanism than the original compression. Whether a specific herniation requires surgery is a clinical determination based on symptom severity, neurological examination, imaging findings, and functional goals. The physician makes the decision. The physics teaches what happens inside the disc during herniation and what the body does to resolve it. The clinical decision of how to manage a specific herniation belongs to the physician who examines you. I sat with the resorption timeline the week my own follow-up MRI showed a smaller herniation than the original scan. 6 months between images. The macrophages had been working the entire time, digesting the material. The first MRI presented as a structural emergency. The wall breached, the gel extruded, and the immune system that had never seen the material began digesting it. Most herniations resolved this way. The physics was working the entire time.